REBA McENTIRE finds teen playing one of her songs in the subway. What she does next changes his life forever. The alarm clock screamed at 4:30 in the morning, its shrill cry cutting through the silence of the cramped apartment like a knife through butter. Jacob Miller's eyes snapped open, his thin frame jolting upright in the narrow bed that doubled as his desk chair during homework hours. The sound that would make most teenagers groan and hit snooze filled him with a strange mixture of dread and hope. Today marked 8 months and 12 days since he had started his routine, and like every morning before, he wondered if this would be the day that changed everything. The floorboards creaked under his bare feet as he tiptoed across the small room he shared with his younger sister, Emma. She stirred slightly in her bed, her 7-year-old face peaceful in sleep, unaware of the weight her older brother carried on his shoulders. Jacob paused at their shared dresser, pulling out his least wrinkled shirt and the jeans that had seen better days, but still held together thanks to his mother's careful stitching. Down the narrow hallway he could hear the familiar sounds of his mother's restless sleep. Sarah Miller had been fighting her battle with cancer for over a year now, and the medication made her nights difficult. Jacob had learned to move like a ghost through their small apartment, preserving every precious moment of rest she could get. He grabbed his toothbrush and splashed cold water on his face, staring at his reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. At 15, Jacob looked younger than his years, his face still holding traces of childhood, despite the adult responsibilities he had shouldered. His sandy brown hair fell across his forehead, and his green eyes held a depth that seemed too old for someone who should be worried about algebra tests and school dances instead of medical bills and grocery money. He had his father's eyes, his mother always said, though Jacob barely remembered the man who had left when the medical bills started piling up 2 years ago. The kitchen was barely large enough for 2 people, but Jacob had mastered the art of preparing breakfast in near silence. He poured the last of the cereal into a bowl for Emma and left it covered on the small table, along with a note reminding her to take her lunch money from the jar on the counter. Their mother would sleep until at least 9, giving Jacob enough time to catch 3 different buses and make it to downtown Nashville before the morning rush hour really kicked in. He slung his father's old guitar case over his shoulder, feeling the familiar weight of the instrument that had become both his burden and his salvation. The case was covered in faded stickers from places Jacob had never been, and bands he discovered through late-night radio shows. Inside, nestled in worn velvet lining, lay a 1976 Martin acoustic guitar that had belonged to his grandfather. It was the only thing of real value their family owned, and Jacob knew his mother had been tempted more than once to sell it to pay for her treatments. The first bus arrived at 5:45, nearly empty except for a few early shift workers and night shift employees heading home. Jacob took his usual seat in the back, carefully placing the guitar case beside him and watching Nashville wake up through the scratched window. The city had always felt like a living, breathing entity to him, full of dreams and broken hearts, success stories and cautionary tales. Somewhere in those streets his musical heroes had walked the same paths he walked now, chasing the same impossible dream that kept him getting up before dawn every morning. By the time he reached downtown, the sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. Jacob had tried several different locations over the months, but he always came back to the underground metro station at Music City Center. The acoustics were perfect, the morning commuter traffic was steady, and most importantly, the security guards had grown accustomed to seeing him and generally left him alone as long as he didn't cause any problems. If you've ever wondered what it takes to pursue a dream when the world seems stacked against you, I invite you to subscribe to our channel and share your own stories of perseverance in the comments below. Let us know where you're watching from and what dreams you're chasing. Your support means everything to creators like us who believe in the power of inspiring stories. Jacob descended the concrete steps into the underground station, the familiar smell of urban transit mixing with the faint aroma of coffee from the small vendor cart near the entrance. He had his routine down to a science now. He would claim his spot on the bench near the southbound platform, tune his guitar carefully, and begin with softer songs to warm up his voice before the real crowd started flowing through. His case opened with practiced ease, revealing the burgundy interior and the small collection of bills and coins from yesterday's earnings. $18.37. Not bad for a Tuesday, but still not enough. Jacob had been keeping meticulous records in a small notebook, tucked into the case's side pocket. He needed at least $50 a day to make a real difference in their household budget, and he was averaging about 35. It wasn't enough to cover his mother's medication co-pays, but it helped with groceries and kept the electricity from being shut off. He pulled out the guitar and settled it comfortably in his lap, his fingers automatically finding the familiar chord shapes that had become second nature over the years. His grandfather had taught him the basics when Jacob was 8 years old, during one of their rare visits before the old man passed away. "Music isn't about the notes you play," his grandfather had said, his weathered hands guiding Jacob's small fingers across the fretboard. "It's about the feeling you put behind them. You can teach technique, but you can't teach soul." Jacob started with a gentle finger-picking pattern, testing the guitar's tuning and letting his voice warm up with a soft, humming melody. A few early commuters walked past, their footsteps echoing against the tiled walls, most absorbed in their phones or newspapers. He had learned not to take the indifference personally. People had their own lives, their own problems, their own destinations that seemed far more important than a teenager with a guitar. But today felt different somehow. Maybe it was because today was his mother's birthday, and he had been unable to scrape together enough money for even a small gift. Maybe it was the weight of 8 months of morning routines and afternoon disappointments. Or maybe it was simply the way the morning light filtered down through the station's skylights, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere in the underground space. Jacob closed his eyes and let his fingers find the opening chords to Fancy, one of the songs that had shaped his understanding of storytelling through music. He had discovered REBA McENTIRE's music through his mother, who used to sing along to the radio while doing housework in better days. There was something about the way REBA could take a story of struggle and transform it into something powerful and triumphant that resonated deeply with Jacob's own circumstances. His voice started soft, almost tentative, but as the familiar lyrics flowed from his memory, something shifted. The song wasn't just about a fictional character anymore. It was about dignity in the face of poverty, about doing whatever it took to survive and ultimately thrive. It was about his mother working double shifts before she got sick, about his own early morning routine, about the hope that somewhere beyond these underground tunnels lay a different kind of life. As his voice grew stronger, Jacob noticed a few people slowing their pace as they passed. An older woman in a business suit paused near a pillar, pretending to check her phone while actually listening. A construction worker sat down on a nearby bench, setting his lunch cooler beside him and nodding along to the rhythm. These small acknowledgements meant everything to Jacob. Tiny validations that his music could reach people, could touch something real inside them. What Jacob didn't notice as he lost himself in the song's emotional crescendo was the figure standing at the top of the stairs, leading down to the platform. Dressed in dark jeans, a simple black sweater, oversized sunglasses and a baseball cap pulled low, the woman had been about to rush past like everyone else when the sound of a young voice singing one of her most beloved songs made her stop in her tracks. REBA McENTIRE had been in the music business for over 4 decades, and she thought she had heard every possible interpretation of her songs. But there was something in this young voice that made her heart skip a beat, something raw and authentic that cut through all the polished performances she was accustomed to hearing. She found herself slowly descending the steps, drawn by a combination of curiosity and something deeper that she couldn't quite name. The voice belonged to a boy who couldn't have been more than 16, his slight frame hunched over an old guitar that looked like it had seen better decades. His case was open in front of him, containing more hope than money, and there was something about the way he sang that suggested every word came from personal experience, rather than mere performance. REBA positioned herself behind a support pillar, where she could observe without being noticed, her trained ear picking up nuances in the boy's technique that impressed her more with each passing phrase. He had natural vibrato, perfect pitch, and most importantly, he had that indefinable quality that separated real artists from talented amateurs. He had soul. As Jacob finished the song, his fingers lingering on the final chord until it faded into the ambient noise of the station, REBA found herself fighting back unexpected tears. She had performed Fancy thousands of times over the years, but hearing it through this young man's voice reminded her why she had fallen in love with music in the first place. It wasn't about fame or fortune or sold-out arenas. It was about connection, about sharing pieces of your heart with strangers and hoping they understood. The morning rush was beginning to intensify now, and Jacob prepared to launch into his next song, unaware that his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. He glanced at his watch and smiled slightly, knowing that somewhere above ground His mother was probably just waking up, and maybe, just maybe, today would be the day he earned enough to buy her something special for her birthday. But before Jacob could strike the opening chords of his next song, the sound of approaching footsteps and a harsh voice cut through the underground ambience like a blade, announcing the arrival of trouble that would test everything he had worked for over the past 8 months. "Hey, you kid with the guitar," the voice boomed across the platform, causing several commuters to turn and look. Jacob's fingers froze above the strings as he looked up to see a heavy-set man in a Metro Authority uniform striding toward him with obvious irritation written across his face. Richard Hensley had been working for Nashville's Metropolitan Transit Authority for 12 years, and he took his job very seriously. Too seriously, according to most of his colleagues, but Hensley prided himself on maintaining order in his assigned stations. "You can't just set up shop here like you own the place," Hensley continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was used to being obeyed without question. "This is a public transit facility, not your personal concert hall." Several passengers had stopped to watch the unfolding confrontation, creating a small semicircle of curious onlookers around Jacob's bench. Jacob's heart began to race, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had encountered authority figures before during his 8 months of busking, but none quite as aggressive as this one. "Sir, I'm not blocking any walkways or bothering anyone," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "I've been playing here for months without any complaints." Hensley's face reddened slightly, and he took another step closer. "Complaints? You think I need complaints to do my job? You need a permit to perform in metropolitan transit facilities, and I guarantee you don't have one." He gestured dismissively at Jacob's guitar case and the small collection of money inside. "This is panhandling, pure and simple, and it's not allowed on Metro property." Eyes to throws from her position behind the support pillar, REBA watched the scene unfold with growing concern. She had seen enough injustice in her life to recognize it when she saw it, and something about the way this official was bullying a polite teenager made her blood boil. The boy hadn't been causing any trouble that she could see, and his music had actually been brightening what was normally a dreary commute for the handful of people who had stopped to listen. "I understand your position, sir," Jacob replied, carefully placing his guitar back in its case. His hands were shaking slightly, but his voice remained respectful. "I can move to a different location if that would be better." He had learned long ago that confrontation with authority figures rarely ended well for someone in his position. Better to retreat and find another spot than to risk having his guitar confiscated. But Hensley wasn't satisfied with simple compliance. There was something about the teenager's quiet dignity that seemed to irritate him further, as if Jacob's politeness was somehow an affront to his authority. "Moving to a different location isn't going to solve the problem, son. The problem is that you think you can just show up wherever you want and start performing without permission. That's not how the world works." "What exactly is the problem here?" The question came from an elderly gentleman in an expensive suit who had been listening to Jacob's music while waiting for his train. Dr. William Bradford was a retired physician who had been taking the Metro to volunteer at a downtown clinic, and he had been genuinely enjoying the young man's performance. The boy wasn't bothering anyone. In fact, he was making the morning commute a little more pleasant for those of us who appreciate good music. Hensley turned his attention to Dr. Bradford, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "The problem, sir, is that unauthorized performances are not permitted in Metro facilities. It's a matter of public safety and order." His voice took on the rehearsed quality of someone reciting regulations from memory. "Public safety?" Dr. Bradford's eyebrows rose skeptically. "A young man sitting quietly on a bench with an acoustic guitar poses a threat to public safety? I've been riding these trains for 20 years, and I've seen actual problems. This isn't one of them." A small crowd had gathered now, drawn by the increasingly heated discussion. Among them was Maria Santos, a nurse heading home from her night shift at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, who had been moved to tears by Jacob's rendition of "Fancy." She had grown up in poverty herself and recognized the authentic emotion in the young man's voice. "Excuse me," Maria interjected, stepping forward despite her natural shyness. "I've been listening to this young man sing for several months now, and he's never caused any problems. His music makes my morning better after working 12-hour shifts. Why are you harassing him?" Hensley's face grew even redder as he found himself facing multiple challenges to his authority. In his mind, he was simply doing his job, maintaining the order and discipline that kept the transit system running smoothly. "Why are you harassing him?" Hensley's face grew even redder as he found himself facing multiple challenges to his authority. In his mind, he was simply doing his job, maintaining the order and discipline that kept the transit system running smoothly. but the growing crowd of supporters around the teenager was making him feel defensive and increasingly aggressive. Harassing him? "I'm enforcing Metropolitan Transit Authority regulations," Hensley snapped. "Regulations that exist for good reasons, whether you understand them or not." He turned back to Jacob, who was now standing beside his guitar case, clearly preparing to leave. "And you, young man, need to understand that if I see you performing in any metro facility again, I'll be confiscating that guitar as evidence of your violation." The threat hit Jacob like a physical blow. The guitar wasn't just his means of earning money, it was his connection to his grandfather, his mother's reminder of better times, and his hope for a different future. Losing it would mean losing everything he had been working toward for the past 8 months. "Sir, please," Jacob's voice cracked slightly for the first time. "This guitar belonged to my grandfather. It's all I have left of him, and it's how I'm trying to help my family. I'll leave and won't come back, but please don't take it away from me." The raw emotion in Jacob's plea seemed to affect several people in the crowd, but Hensley remained unmoved. If anything, the teenager's obvious distress seemed to embolden him. "Should have thought about that before you decided to ignore metro regulations. Actions have consequences, son. Maybe losing that guitar will teach you to respect authority and follow the rules like everyone else." It was at that moment that REBA MCENTIRE had heard enough. She had spent her entire career fighting for the underdog, championing the cause of ordinary people trying to make their way in an often unfair world. Watching this petty bureaucrat threaten to destroy a talented young man's dreams over a technicality violated every principle she held dear. Stepping out from behind the pillar, REBA removed her sunglasses and baseball cap, revealing her famous red hair and unmistakable features. The effect on the crowd was immediate and dramatic. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, phones came out to capture the moment, and even Hensley's aggressive posture faltered as he tried to process what was happening. "Excuse me," REBA said, her voice carrying the warm authority that had commanded stages around the world for decades. "I couldn't help but overhear this conversation, and I think there might be a misunderstanding here." She walked directly to Jacob's side, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. "This young man has been sharing his gift with commuters, brightening their day and asking for nothing more than appreciation. Where exactly is the harm in that?" Hensley's mouth opened and closed several times as he tried to formulate a response. Recognizing REBA MCENTIRE was one thing, but figuring out how to maintain his authority in the face of country music royalty was quite another. "Ma'am, with all due respect to who you are regulations. They apply to everyone equally, regardless of talent or circumstances." REBA's smile was pleasant, but her eyes held a steel that anyone who knew her would have recognized. "Regulations, of course. And tell me, Mr. She glanced at his name tag. "Hensley, how many permits have you personally issued for street performers in metro facilities?" The question caught Hensley off guard. The truth was that the Metro Authority rarely issued such permits, and the application process was deliberately complicated and expensive, designed more to discourage performers than to accommodate them. "That's not my department," he replied stiffly. "I enforce the rules, I don't make them." "Ah, I see," REBA nodded thoughtfully. "So you're telling this talented young man that he needs something that's virtually impossible to get, and when he can't get it, you're threatening to confiscate the instrument he uses to help support his family. Does that sound reasonable to you?" The crowd around them had grown larger, and REBA was acutely aware that phones were recording every word of this confrontation, but she had learned long ago that sometimes you had to take a stand, regardless of the potential consequences. This wasn't about her reputation or her image. It was about a fundamental question of fairness and human decency. Jacob stood frozen beside her, still processing the fact that REBA MCENTIRE was not only defending him, but seemed genuinely invested in the outcome of this confrontation. He had dreamed of meeting his musical hero someday, but never under circumstances like these, and certainly never with her fighting on his behalf against an overzealous bureaucrat. Hensley, meanwhile, was beginning to realize that he had stumbled into a situation far more complicated than a simple busking violation. The presence of a major celebrity, the growing crowd of supporters, and the recording phones had transformed what should have been a routine enforcement action into a potential public relations nightmare. But Richard Hensley had not spent 12 years in transit authority enforcement by backing down from confrontations, even uncomfortable ones. If anything, the presence of cameras made him more determined to assert his authority. and show that regulations apply to everyone equally, regardless of fame or public sentiment. Regulations exist for everyone's protection, he said, his voice taking on the rigid tone of someone who has decided to make a stand regardless of consequences. And if this young man continues to perform without proper authorization, celebrity endorsement or not, I will be forced to take appropriate action. The challenge had been issued, and REBA MCENTIRE had never been one to back down from a fight, especially when it involved protecting someone who couldn't protect themselves. What happened next would be talked about in Nashville for years to come, but in that moment, all REBA could think about was a talented teenager who reminded her of her own humble beginnings and the dreams that had sustained her through countless rejections and setbacks. The confrontation was about to escalate in ways that none of them could have predicted, and Jacob Miller's quiet morning routine was about to become the center of a story that would change not just his life, but the lives of countless other young dreamers who had ever dared to hope that talent and determination might be enough to overcome the obstacles standing in their way. REBA looked around at the growing crowd of commuters, many of whom were now openly recording the confrontation with their phones. She had spent enough years in the entertainment industry to understand the power of public opinion, and she could see that the tide was turning against Hensley's rigid interpretation of regulations. But more than that, she could see something in Jacob's eyes that reminded her of herself at that age, desperate for a chance and willing to work harder than anyone else for it. "Mr. Hensley," REBA said, her voice taking on the commanding tone she used when addressing concert audiences of 50,000 people, "I have a proposition for you. Instead of confiscating this young man's guitar and crushing his dreams, why don't we turn this into something positive?" She gestured to the crowd around them, which now numbered nearly 30 people, all watching with rapt attention. "What kind of proposition?" Hensley asked suspiciously, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of so much scrutiny. He had expected this to be a simple enforcement action, over in minutes, not a prolonged public spectacle with one of country music's biggest stars taking the opposite side. "Let Jacob play one more song," REBA suggested. "If the people here, the actual commuters who use this station every day, think his music adds value to their morning rather than detracting from it, then perhaps we can find a way to work within your regulations to let him continue." She paused, letting her words sink in. "And if they think he's a problem, then he'll pack up and leave voluntarily." The suggestion was clever, REBA knew, because it put the decision in the hands of the very people Hensley claimed to be protecting. Dr. Bradford immediately nodded his approval, and Maria Santos began encouraging other commuters to stay and listen. Even some people who had been hurrying to catch trains slowed their pace, curious to see how this unusual situation would resolve itself. Hensley found himself trapped between his rigid interpretation of policy and the practical reality that opposing REBA MCENTIRE in front of a crowd of potential voters was likely to create more problems than it solved. Nashville was a music town after all, and the story of a transit authority official shutting down a talented teenager while a beloved country star tried to help him would not reflect well on the metropolitan government. "One song," he said finally, his voice tight with reluctance. "But this doesn't change the fact that he needs proper permits to perform regularly in metro facilities." Jacob, who had been listening to this exchange in stunned silence, suddenly found himself at the center of everyone's attention. His hands were trembling as he lifted his guitar from its case, and he could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. This wasn't just about avoiding trouble anymore. This was about proving himself in front of his musical idol and a crowd of strangers who would determine whether his dreams had any validity. "What would you like to hear?" REBA asked gently, settling onto the bench beside him. Her presence was both comforting and terrifying, like being asked to sing a duet with an angel while standing on the edge of a cliff. Jacob's mind raced through his repertoire, trying to choose something that would showcase his abilities, while also touching the hearts of the diverse group of people gathered around him. His eyes landed on a woman in scrubs, who looked exhausted from what had probably been a long shift, an older man in a business suit checking his watch impatiently, and several younger commuters who seemed more interested in recording the spectacle than listening to music. "Consider me gone," he said quietly, naming another REBA MCENTIRE song that had become one of his favorites over the months of busking. It was a song about resilience, about walking away from situations that no longer served you while maintaining your dignity and hope for something better. REBA's eyes lit up with approval and something that looked like pride. "That's a good choice," she said, It's a song about knowing your worth and not settling for less than you deserve. Her words were clearly directed at Jacob, but her eyes never left Hensley's face as she spoke. Jacob positioned his fingers on the fretboard, took a deep breath, and began to play. The familiar melody filled the underground space, but this time it carried a weight and significance that it had never held before. He wasn't just performing for tips now, he was performing for his future, for his right to exist in this space, for his mother's medical bills and his sister's school lunches and his grandfather's memory. His voice started soft and uncertain, but as the lyrics began to flow, something magical happened. The noise of the surrounding city seemed to fade away, the pressure of the watching crowd dissolved, and Jacob found himself lost in the story the song was telling. He wasn't thinking about REBA MCENTIRE sitting beside him, or Richard Hensley glowering from across the platform, or the dozens of phones recording every note. He was simply telling a story about strength and determination, and the courage to walk away from situations that diminish your spirit. As he reached the chorus, something unexpected happened. REBA began to sing along, her powerful voice blending with his in perfect harmony. The effect was electrifying. Commuters who had been hurrying past stopped in their tracks, drawn by the sound of two voices creating something beautiful together, in the most unlikely of settings. Dr. Bradford felt tears welling up in his eyes as he listened to the impromptu duet. In 40 years of practicing medicine, he had seen countless examples of human resilience and dignity, but there was something about watching this teenager hold his own alongside one of music's greatest performers that moved him deeply. Maria Santos pulled out her phone, but instead of recording the performance, she began texting her daughter, telling her about the incredible scene unfolding in the metro station. "You have to see this," she wrote. "A kid about your age is singing with REBA MCENTIRE in the subway, and it's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Even some of Hensley's colleagues, who had arrived as backup when they heard about the commotion, found themselves caught up in the music. Officer Janet Rodriguez, a transit police officer who had been prepared to support Hensley's enforcement action, discovered herself humming along to the chorus despite her professional obligations. As the song built toward its climax, Jacob's confidence grew. He could feel the audience responding to the music, could sense that he was connecting with them on a level that transcended the bureaucratic dispute that had started this whole encounter. This was why he got up at 4:30 every morning, why he rode 3 buses to get to this underground station, why he was willing to risk his grandfather's guitar for the chance to share his gift with the world. When the final notes faded away, the silence in the station was profound. For a moment, nobody moved or spoke, as if breaking the spell might diminish what they had just witnessed. Then slowly, the applause began. It started with Dr. Bradford clapping enthusiastically, spread to Maria Santos and the other regular commuters, who had been listening to Jacob for months, and eventually encompassed nearly everyone on the platform. "That was extraordinary," Dr. Bradford said, approaching Jacob with obvious emotion in his voice. "Young man, you have a gift that shouldn't be hidden away. The world needs to hear what you just shared with us." Several other commuters echoed his sentiment, and Jacob found himself surrounded by people asking about his story, offering encouragement, and dropping significantly more money into his guitar case than he usually collected in an entire morning. But more valuable than the money were the words of support and validation from strangers who had been moved by his performance. Hensley, meanwhile, found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. The crowd's response to Jacob's performance made it clear that the young man was not creating a disturbance or bothering anyone. If anything, he was providing a service that people genuinely appreciated and valued. Confiscating his guitar now would look petty and vindictive rather than professionally necessary. REBA stood up from the bench and addressed the crowd that had gathered. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you just heard was raw talent combined with genuine heart. This young man gets up before dawn every day to share his gift with all of you, asking for nothing more than the chance to make your commute a little brighter while he works to support his family." She turned to look directly at Hensley. "Mr. Hensley, I think the people have spoken pretty clearly about whether Jacob's presence here is a problem or a blessing. The question now is whether the Metropolitan Transit Authority wants to be remembered as the organization that nurtured local talent or the one that crushed it over technicalities." The weight of public opinion was clearly shifting, and Hensley could feel it. Several people in the crowd were taking pictures of his name tag and badge number, obviously planning to share their opinions about his handling of the situation with his supervisors. The smart move, both professionally and personally, would be to find a graceful way to back down while saving face. But Richard Hensley had built his career on rigid adherence to rules and regulations, and admitting that he might have been wrong in front of a crowd of witnesses went against every instinct he had developed over 12 years of enforcement work. Instead of retreating, he doubled down on his position, making a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his career. "Regulations exist for everyone's protection," he said loudly, his voice cutting through the conversations that had started among the crowd. "And no amount of celebrity endorsement or public sentiment is going to change the fact that unauthorized performances are not permitted in metro facilities." He pointed directly at Jacob. "You have been warned, and if I find you performing here again, there will be consequences." The crowd's reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. Several people began shouting their disapproval, questioning Hensley's priorities, and suggesting that he focus on real problems instead of harassing talented teenagers. The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control, and REBA realized that something dramatic needed to happen to shift the narrative in Jacob's favor. What she did next would be replayed on social media millions of times over the following weeks, turning a local confrontation into a national conversation about bureaucracy, artistic expression, and the power of standing up for what's right. But in that moment, REBA wasn't thinking about viral videos or public relations. She was thinking about a gifted young man who deserved better than to have his dreams crushed by petty officialdom, and she was prepared to use every ounce of her fame and influence to make sure that didn't happen. REBA pulled out her phone and, without any fanfare or announcement, began dialing a number while the crowd watched in fascination. "Hello, Mayor's office. This is REBA McENTIRE. I need to speak with Mayor Cooper immediately about a situation at the Music City Center metro station." Her voice carried clearly across the platform, and the effect on Hensley was immediate and visible. His face went pale as he realized that this confrontation was about to escalate far beyond his pay grade. Within minutes, REBA was connected directly to Nashville's mayor, and she put the call on speakerphone so everyone could hear both sides of the conversation. "Mayor Cooper, I'm standing here in one of your metro stations watching a transit authority employee threaten to confiscate a guitar from a 15-year-old boy whose only crime is being talented and trying to help his sick mother pay medical bills." Mayor Cooper's voice came through clearly, tinged with concern and obvious recognition of the potential public relations disaster brewing in his city's transit system. "Ms. McENTIRE, can you give me more details about what's happening? I want to make sure we handle this situation appropriately." "Certainly," REBA replied, her voice taking on the professional tone she used during business meetings. "This young man, Jacob Miller, has been performing in your metro stations for 8 months, brightening commuters' mornings and earning money to help with his mother's cancer treatments. Today, Transit Authority Supervisor Richard Hensley decided to threaten him with confiscation of his grandfather's guitar unless he stops performing." She gestured to Jacob, who stood frozen beside his guitar case, still processing the surreal turn his morning had taken. "Jacob just performed with me for a crowd of 30 commuters, all of whom clearly appreciated his talent and presence here. Yet Mr. Hensley remains determined to shut him down over permit technicalities that, frankly, seem designed to prevent exactly the kind of positive community engagement we just witnessed." Mayor Cooper's response was swift and decisive. "Ms. McENTIRE, could you please put Supervisor Hensley on the phone? I'd like to speak with him directly." Hensley's hands were visibly shaking as he took REBA's phone. His morning had started with what he thought would be a routine enforcement action, and now he found himself explaining his decisions to the mayor, while surrounded by a crowd of increasingly hostile witnesses and social media cameras. "Mayor Cooper, sir, I was simply enforcing Metropolitan Transit Authority regulations regarding unauthorized performances in transit facilities," Hensley said, his voice tight with barely controlled anxiety. "Regulations exist for reasons, sir, and they need to be applied consistently regardless of public sentiment or celebrity involvement." "Supervisor Hensley, help me understand something." Mayor Cooper's voice carried the patient but firm tone of someone accustomed to managing complex political situations. "Has this young man been causing any actual problems? Complaints from commuters, safety issues, disruption of transit operations?" Hensley glanced around at the crowd, many of whom were shaking their heads and calling out variations of "no problems at all" and "he makes our mornings better." His case for enforcement was crumbling in real time, but his pride and adherence to protocol prevented him from admitting error. "Sir, the absence of complaints doesn't negate the violation of regulations," he replied stiffly. "Unauthorized performances are unauthorized performances, regardless of their quality or public reception." There was a pause before Mayor Cooper responded, and when he did, his displeasure was evident even through the phone speaker. "Supervisor Hensley, I want you to listen carefully. The city of Nashville has built its reputation as Music City precisely because we celebrate and nurture musical talent wherever we find it. Threatening to confiscate a teenager's guitar for sharing that talent with commuters goes against everything our city stands for." REBA watched Jacob's face as he heard these words. The relief and hope in his eyes were almost heartbreaking, as if he was afraid to believe that this powerful intervention on his behalf was really happening. She reached over and squeezed his shoulder reassuringly, a gesture that several phones captured, and would later become one of the most shared images from the entire incident. "Furthermore," Mayor Cooper continued, "I want you to issue an immediate apology to this young man and to Ms. McENTIRE for your handling of this situation. And Supervisor Hensley, I'll be having a conversation with your department head about reviewing our policies regarding street performances in metro facilities. It seems we may need to find ways to accommodate positive community engagement rather than discouraging it." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, clearly delighted by this turn of events. Hensley, meanwhile, looked like he wanted the platform floor to open up and swallow him whole. Being publicly dressed down by the mayor in front of dozens of witnesses and recording devices was a humiliation that would follow him for the rest of his career. I apologize," Hensley said quietly, barely audible over the crowd's celebration. But REBA wasn't about to let him off with a mumbled, half-hearted apology. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hensley, but I don't think Jacob heard you," she said, her voice sweet but carrying an edge of steel. "Could you speak up so everyone can hear your apology to this talented young man?" Hensley's face burned with embarrassment, but with the mayor still on the line and the crowd clearly expecting a proper apology, he had no choice but to comply. "Jacob, I apologize for threatening to confiscate your guitar and for preventing you from sharing your musical talents with the community. I was overzealous in my interpretation of regulations." The apology was grudging and obviously forced, but it was public and recorded, which meant Hensley couldn't later claim the incident had been handled differently. Jacob, showing a maturity beyond his 15 years, simply nodded and said, "Thank you, sir. I understand you were just doing your job." But REBA wasn't finished. She took her phone back from Hensley and addressed Mayor Cooper directly. "Mayor Cooper, I have a proposal that might turn this unfortunate situation into something positive for your city." "I'm listening," came the mayor's voice, clearly curious about what the country music superstar had in mind. "What if the city of Nashville created an official program to support and showcase emerging musical talent in appropriate public spaces? Street performers and buskers have been part of Nashville's musical heritage for generations, but many of them operate in a legal gray area that leaves them vulnerable to situations like what we witness today." REBA began pacing slightly as she warmed to her theme, her business acumen and years of industry experience coming together in a spontaneous pitch that would have made her management team proud. Imagine designated performance spaces in high-traffic areas, simple permit processes for qualified musicians, and maybe even a mentorship component where established artists could work with emerging talent. The crowd was listening intently now, sensing that they were witnessing something potentially historic. Jacob stood beside his guitar case, still struggling to process how his morning busking routine had transformed into a conversation about citywide policy changes with country music royalty and the mayor of Nashville. "That's a fascinating idea, Ms. McENTIRE," Mayor Cooper replied thoughtfully. "Could we perhaps continue this conversation in my office later today? I'd be very interested in exploring how we might implement something like that." "Absolutely," REBA agreed. "And I'd like Jacob here to be part of that conversation, since he represents exactly the kind of talented young artist your program should be designed to help." Jacob's mouth fell open in shock. Being invited to a meeting with the mayor of Nashville to discuss policy changes that would affect street performers throughout the city was so far beyond anything he could have imagined when he got up at 4:30 that morning that he briefly wondered if he was dreaming. "Dr." Bradford stepped forward from the crowd. "If I may, Mayor Cooper, I'd like to add my voice to Ms. McENTIRE's proposal. I've been listening to this young man perform for months, and his presence here has genuinely improved the quality of life for commuters like myself. Creating official support for artists like Jacob would be a tremendous asset to our city. Several other commuters voiced their agreement, creating a chorus of public support for the idea that was being captured by dozens of recording devices. The story was already spreading across social media platforms, with hashtags like Jacob and REBA and Music City support beginning to trend locally. Maria Santos, who had been quietly filming parts of the encounter, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "Jacob, I want you to know that your music has gotten me through some of the hardest days of my life. Working night shifts at the hospital, seeing so much pain and suffering, sometimes your songs were the only beautiful thing in my day. Thank you for sharing your gift with all of us." Her words seemed to break something open in Jacob, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he started to cry. Not from fear or stress, but from overwhelming gratitude, and the realization that his music had actually mattered to people, that his early morning routine had created genuine value in the world beyond just earning money for his family's bills. REBA wrapped her arm around Jacob's shoulders as he struggled to compose himself. "You see," she said, addressing the crowd and the phones still recording everything, "this is what music is really about. It's not about fame or fortune or sold-out arenas. It's about connection. It's about sharing pieces of our hearts with strangers and discovering that we're not alone in this world." She looked directly into one of the cameras. "Jacob Miller gets up before dawn every day to come here and share his gift with all of you. He does it because his mother is fighting cancer and he wants to help. He does it because music is in his soul and he can't help but share it with the world. And he does it with dignity and grace and respect for everyone around him." Her voice grew stronger, taking on the commanding presence that had filled concert halls for decades. "If we as a community can't find ways to support and encourage young people like Jacob, then what kind of city are we really? What kind of society are we building for future generations?" The crowd erupted in applause again, but this time it was different. This wasn't just approval for a good performance or satisfaction at seeing bureaucratic overreach challenged. This was the sound of people recognizing a moment of genuine significance, a turning point that would be remembered and talked about for years to come. Hensley, meanwhile, had quietly retreated to the edge of the platform, clearly hoping to escape further attention. But his role in this story wasn't quite over yet. The videos being recorded would soon make him the face of bureaucratic rigidity and small-minded enforcement, a cautionary tale about what happens when following rules becomes more important than serving the community those rules are supposed to protect. Mayor Cooper's voice came through the phone one final time. "Ms. McEntire, Jacob, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for bringing this situation to my attention. I look forward to our meeting this afternoon, and I want to assure everyone that the city of Nashville will always support artistic expression and the talented individuals who make our city special." As the call ended and the crowd began to disperse, many commuters stopping to drop money in Jacob's case and share words of encouragement, REBA realized that what had started as a simple act of standing up for a bullied teenager had grown into something much larger. But the real transformation was just beginning, and Jacob Miller's journey from unknown busker to national sensation was about to accelerate in ways that would surprise everyone involved, including REBA herself. 3 hours later, Jacob found himself sitting in the mayor's conference room, still clutching his grandfather's guitar and trying to process the surreal turn his life had taken. Across the polished mahogany table sat Mayor Cooper, REBA McEntire, the head of the Metropolitan Transit Authority, and several city council members who had been hastily summoned when the subway incident began trending nationally on social media. The videos from that morning had already been viewed over 2 million times across various platforms, with major news outlets picking up the story and framing it as everything from country music legend saves teen busker to bureaucracy versus artistry. In Music City, Jacob's phone, which had been mostly silent except for occasional texts from his mother and sister, was now buzzing constantly with friend requests, interview requests, and messages of support from strangers around the world. "Jacob," Mayor Cooper said, leaning forward with genuine interest, "before we talk about policy changes, I want to understand your story better. REBA mentioned that you're doing this to help with your mother's medical expenses. Can you tell us more about your situation?" Jacob glanced nervously at REBA, who nodded encouragingly. Speaking to authority figures had never been easy for him, but something about the morning's events had given him a new confidence in his own worth and the validity of his dreams. "My mother, Sarah Miller, was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer 14 months ago," Jacob began, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of the topic. "The treatments are expensive, even with insurance, and she hasn't been able to work consistently since she started chemotherapy. My father left when the medical bills started piling up, so it's just me, my mom, and my 7-year-old sister, Emma." He paused, gathering his thoughts and his courage. "I started playing in the metro stations because I wanted to help, but also because music is the only thing I've ever been really good at. My grandfather taught me to play when I was 8, and he always said that music was meant to be shared, not hidden away. I figured if I could make even a small difference in our family's finances while doing something I loved, then getting up at 4:30 every morning was worth it." The room was silent as Jacob spoke, and he could see genuine emotion in the faces around the table. REBA reached over and squeezed his hand supportively, a gesture that meant more to him than any amount of money could have. "How much were you typically earning?" asked Councilwoman Patricia Martinez, who had arrived with a stack of papers and an obvious interest in the practical aspects of Jacob's situation. "On a good day, maybe $40 or $50, Jacob replied. "On slow days, sometimes only 15 or 20. It wasn't enough to solve all our problems, but it helped with groceries and keeping the electricity on, and it made me feel like I was contributing something meaningful instead of just being another burden on my mom." Mayor Cooper exchanged glances with the other officials around the table. "Jacob, what if I told you that your story this morning has already generated more support for your family than months of busking ever could?" Jacob looked confused, so REBA pulled out her phone and showed him the screen. "Honey, while we've been in this meeting, people have been sharing your story and donating to help your mother's medical expenses. Look at this." The crowdfunding page that had been created by a stranger who saw the viral video already showed donations totaling over $80,000, with more coming in every few minutes. Jacob stared at the number in disbelief, his eyes filling with tears as he realized what this meant for his family. "That's not all," REBA continued, her voice gentle but excited. "I've been on the phone with my management team and my record label. We want to offer you something that could change your life, but only if it's what you really want." Jacob looked up at her with a mixture of hope and terror. The day had already brought more changes than he could process, and he was afraid to hope for anything else, in case he woke up and discovered it had all been an elaborate dream. "We'd like to invite you to open for my show at the Grand Ole Opry next Friday night," REBA said, watching Jacob's face carefully. "It would give you a chance to perform for a real audience, to see if this is the path you want to pursue professionally, and regardless of whether you decide music is your career or just your passion, we want to make sure you and your family are taken care of." Jacob's mouth fell open, and for a moment he couldn't speak at all. The Grand Ole Opry was the most prestigious venue in country music, the place where legends were made and dreams came true. The idea of performing on that stage seemed as impossible as flying to the moon. "There's more," Mayor Cooper added, clearly caught up in the momentum of the moment. "The City Council has voted unanimously to create the Nashville Emerging Artist Program based on Miss McEntire's suggestions from this morning. We want you to be our first official participant, with a proper permit to perform in designated areas throughout the metro system." Councilwoman Martinez slid a folder across the table to Jacob. "We're also establishing a scholarship fund for young musicians from low-income families, with full support for both musical education and academic studies. You'll be eligible for full college tuition plus music lessons with some of Nashville's most respected teachers." Jacob looked around the table at the faces of people who just hours ago had been complete strangers. Now they were offering him opportunities that seemed too good to be true, solutions to problems he had been carrying alone for over a year. "I don't understand," he said quietly. "Why are you all doing this for me? This morning I was just a kid with a guitar trying to help pay his mom's medical bills." REBA leaned forward, her expression serious but warm. "Jacob, what happened this morning wasn't really about you or me, or even that officious transit supervisor. It was about recognizing that talent and determination and basic human decency deserve to be supported, not penalized. Your story touched people because it represents something fundamental about the American dream, about the idea that hard work and genuine heart should be rewarded." She gestured toward the window, beyond which the city of Nashville spread out in all its musical glory. Every major artist in this town started exactly where you are right now, with more dreams than money and more passion than opportunities. The difference is that you're getting a chance to skip some of the struggle, to focus on developing your gifts instead of just surviving. Over the following weeks, Jacob's life transformed in ways that seemed almost fictional. The video of his subway encounter with REBA continued to spread globally, eventually reaching over 50 million views and inspiring similar support programs in cities across the country. His performance at the Grand Ole Opry, where he sang an original song he had written about his mother's courage during her cancer battle, received a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. More importantly, his mother's medical expenses were completely covered by the donations that poured in from around the world, and her oncologist reported that her latest tests showed the cancer was responding well to treatment. Emma was able to stay in her school and even join the music program that Jacob's story had helped fund. Richard Hensley, meanwhile, faced the consequences of his rigid approach to regulations. While he wasn't fired outright, he was transferred to a position with less public contact after the Metro Authority received hundreds of complaints about his handling of the Jacob Miller situation. The incident became a case study in training sessions about community engagement and the importance of applying common sense alongside official policies. 6 months after that transformative morning in the subway, Jacob signed his first recording contract, with REBA McENTIRE serving as his mentor and executive producer. His debut single, Subway Miracle, reached #1 on the country charts and earned him invitations to perform at major venues across the nation. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the Nashville Emerging Artist Program, which had identified and supported over 200 young musicians in its first year. Jacob regularly visited the metro stations where new performers were getting their start, offering encouragement and advice based on his own extraordinary journey from anonymous busker to rising star. On the first anniversary of his encounter with REBA, Jacob returned to the same metro platform where it had all begun. This time, however, he wasn't there to earn money for his family's survival. He was there to inaugurate a permanent performance space dedicated to emerging artists, complete with proper sound equipment and a digital donation system that would ensure musicians received fair compensation for sharing their gifts with commuters. As he stood on the platform, now accompanied by reporters and city officials rather than indifferent commuters, Jacob reflected on how a single moment of injustice had been transformed into a movement that was changing lives throughout his city and beyond. His mother, now in remission and standing proudly in the front row, wiped away tears as she listened to her son speak about the importance of supporting artistic dreams and believing in the potential of every young person who dares to hope for something better. "A year ago, I was just a scared kid with a guitar trying to help my family and hoping someone would notice my music," Jacob said to the assembled crowd and the cameras recording his words. "Today, I'm here to tell every young artist in Nashville and everywhere else that your dreams matter, your talents are valuable, and there are people willing to fight for your right to share your gifts with the world." He strummed the opening chords to Fancy, the song that had first caught REBA's attention in this very spot, and as his voice filled the underground space, dozens of commuters stopped to listen, just as they had on that extraordinary morning when a country music legend proved that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stand up for what's right. The story of Jacob Miller and REBA McENTIRE became more than just a viral video or a feel-good news story. It became a testament to the transformative power of recognizing and nurturing talent wherever it appears, and a reminder that the most extraordinary changes often begin with the simplest acts of human decency and courage. As Jacob's voice echoed through the metro station, carrying the same passion and hope that had first attracted REBA's attention, commuters throughout the station paused to listen, their morning routines briefly interrupted by the sound of dreams being lived out loud, proving once again that music has the power to change not just individual lives, but entire communities, one song at a time.